I still remember the smell of the coffee more than anything else. Funny, isn't it? You'd think that on a morning like that one, the thing that would stick with me would be the noise, or the way the ground shook, or the faces. But no. It was the smell of cheap coffee from the little cart on the corner of Knightsbridge, the kind that burns your tongue and tastes like cardboard, and I was holding a cup of it in my hand when the world changed. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter much. I was a tourist that day, like a few thousand other people. I'd flown in from a small town you've never heard of, saved up for 2 years for this trip, and I had a little notebook in my coat pocket where I wrote down everything I saw. I was the kind of person who read every plaque on every statue. My wife used to laugh at me for it. She wasn't with me that day. She'd stayed back at the hotel with a headache, and to this day I thank God for that headache, because I don't know what I would have done if she'd been standing where I was standing. It was a Tuesday. I think it was a Tuesday. Mid-morning, maybe 10:30. The sky over London was that pale gray color it gets when it can't decide whether to rain or not, the clouds sitting low and heavy like they were tired of holding themselves up. There was a bit of a wind coming through the trees of Hyde Park, the kind that makes the leaves whisper, and pigeons kept landing near my feet, hopeful little things, looking for crumbs I didn't have. I was standing near the edge of the park, close to where Park Lane runs alongside it, watching the traffic. Black cabs, red buses, a man on a bicycle in a yellow jacket weaving between them like he had a death wish. Across the road there was one of those grand old buildings with the white columns, and outside it, standing perfectly still, was a soldier. A Royal Guard. Now I'd seen them before, of course. Everyone has, even if it's just in photos. The red tunic, the tall black bearskin hat that seems impossibly heavy, the rifle held just so. They're famous for not moving. Tourists try everything to make them flinch, pulling faces, shouting, dancing about like fools, and the guards just stare straight ahead like statues carved out of discipline itself. This one was no different. He couldn't have been more than 25. Young face under that great big hat, jaw set, eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that only he could see. There was a small group of people gathered in front of him, taking photos, and a little girl, couldn't have been older than 6, was waving at him with both hands, giggling, trying to get him to wave back. He didn't, of course, but I swear just for a second I saw the corner of his mouth twitch, like he wanted to. Like underneath all that training, there was just a young lad who thought the little girl was sweet. I wrote that down in my notebook. Guard nearly smiled at a child. 10:34 a.m. I had no idea that in less than 10 minutes I'd be writing about him again, and my hand would be shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen. The thing about disasters is that they don't announce themselves. There's no music swelling in the background like in the films. No slow build. One moment you're standing there sipping bad coffee and watching a little girl wave at a soldier, and the next moment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell it properly. Let me tell it the way it happened, because if I rush it, you won't understand. And you need to understand. You need to understand what that young man did, because I don't think enough people know. So 10:30, coffee in my hand. The park behind me, the road in front, the guard across the way. There was a tension in the air that morning, though I didn't notice it at the time. Looking back, there were signs. There always are, aren't there? You just don't see them until afterward, when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning replaying it all. There'd been more police about than usual. I remember thinking that. 2 officers on horseback near the park gates and a couple more on foot, and they kept talking into the little radios on their shoulders. I figured it was just London being London. A big city, a lot of important buildings, royalty about, of course there'd be police. I didn't think anything of it. There was also a van. A white van, parked half up on the curb a little way down the road, near a row of shops. Nothing unusual about a white van in a city. There are a million of them. But I noticed it because it had been there a while, and the engine was running. You could see the little shimmer of exhaust coming out the back, and there was nobody in it. The driver's seat was empty. I remember frowning at it for half a second, the way you do when something's slightly off but you can't put your finger on why, and then a bus went past and blocked my view and I forgot all about it. I wish I hadn't forgotten about it. I started walking slowly along the edge of the park, heading roughly in the direction of the guard. I wanted a closer look at the building behind him. I had my notebook out. There was a flower seller on the corner, an older woman with a kind, weathered face, arranging buckets of tulips and daffodils, and she smiled at me as I passed and said something about the weather, about how it might clear up later, and I smiled back and agreed even though neither of us believed it. That flower seller, I think about her a lot too. The crowd around the guard had grown a little. A tour group had arrived, you could tell by the matching lanyards, and the man at the front holding up a folded umbrella so they could all follow him. They clustered in front of the soldier, cameras up. The little girl who'd been waving had been scooped up by her mother and was now sitting on the woman's hip, still staring at the guard with that pure, open wonder that only small children have. And the guard stood there, still as stone, doing his job. I was maybe 30 yards from him when it happened. You want to know what a bomb sounds like up close when you're not expecting it. It doesn't sound like an explosion, not the way you imagine. It's not a boom. It's more like the whole world slaps you all at once everywhere inside and out. There's a pressure that hits your chest before your ears even catch up, a physical shove like a giant invisible hand, and then the sound arrives a half-second later and it's so loud it isn't even a sound anymore, it's just everything. White. Total. The coffee left my hand. I don't remember dropping it. I remember the cup just wasn't there anymore, and neither was the ground, not quite, because I was on it, on my knees in one hand, and there was a high whistling scream in both my ears that drowned out the entire city. For a moment, and I don't know how long this moment lasted, it could have been 1 second or 30, I didn't understand anything. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what had happened. I just knelt there on the pavement with my ears screaming and my heart slamming against my ribs and a strange, dreamlike calm sitting on top of all of it, like my brain had simply refused to process what my body already knew. Then the screaming started, the real screaming, human screaming. And the world came rushing back in all at once. The white van. The white van down the road where the shops were. Except now there was no white van. There was a black, twisted, burning thing where the van had been, and smoke pouring up into that low gray sky, thick and oily and glass. There was glass everywhere. All the shop windows on that side of the street had blown out, and the air was full of a fine gray dust that hadn't been there a moment ago, drifting down like dirty snow. People were running. Some toward me, some away, some in no direction at all, just running because their legs had taken over from their minds. A man stumbled past me clutching his arm, blood running between his fingers, his mouth open in a shout I couldn't hear over the ringing. A woman was on her knees in the road screaming a name, a child's name maybe, I couldn't tell. I got to my feet, I don't know how. My legs didn't feel like mine. There was a cut on my forehead I found out later and blood was running down into my eyebrow, warm and ticklish, but I didn't feel it then. I didn't feel anything except a roaring, animal need to move, to get away, to find somewhere the world wasn't ending. And then I looked across the road, at the guard. He hadn't moved. I want you to understand what I mean by that, because it's the whole reason I'm telling you this story. It's the thing I've never been able to shake, the image that's burned behind my eyes for all these years. Everything was chaos. Everyone, and I mean everyone, was running or screaming or frozen in terror or on the ground. The tour group had scattered like birds. The flower seller's buckets were knocked over, tulips and daffodils strewn across the pavement, bright spots of color in all that gray. Police were shouting. Sirens were already starting up somewhere in the distance, faint under the ringing in my ears. The whole world had come apart at the seams in the space of 2 seconds. And there across the road, outside that grand white building, stood the young royal guard. Still as stone. rifle held just so, eyes fixed straight ahead. He had not flinched, he had not ducked, he had not run. The blast had been close enough that the dust was settling on his red tunic, turning it gray, and his bearskin hat was streaked with it, and behind him a window in the building had cracked into a spiderweb. But he stood at his post like the bomb had been nothing more than a clap of thunder on a summer afternoon. I remember staring at him and feeling something I still don't have the right word for. It wasn't quite disbelief. It was closer to, I don't know, awe maybe. The kind of awe that frightens you a little. Because in that moment, with the world burning and screaming all around me, he was the only fixed point in it. The only thing that hadn't moved. And there was something about that. Something about that one young man standing perfectly still in the middle of all that horror, that reached into my chest and grabbed hold of something and wouldn't let go. I learned later what was going through his mind. He told a reporter, weeks afterward, I read the interview a dozen times, that in the seconds after the blast, every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to drop, to take cover, that he was 23 years old and terrified and he wanted his mother. But he also said that the moment he felt that fear, he felt something else right alongside it. A voice, almost. The voice of every soldier who had ever stood that post before him, going back hundreds of years. And that voice said one thing. You do not move, people are watching. People need to see that someone is still standing. So he didn't move. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Because the guard standing his post, that wasn't the bravest thing he did that day, not by a long way. The bravest thing came about 90 seconds later, and it had nothing to do with standing still. The smoke was getting worse. The wind, which earlier had just been whispering through the trees, was now pushing the thick black smoke from the burning van down the length of the street, and it stung the eyes and clawed at the throat. People were coughing, doubled over. I'd pulled my coat up over my mouth and nose, and I was trying to think, trying to make my rattled brain do something useful, when I heard a new sound cut through the ringing. A voice shouting. Not in panic, in command. Get back, everyone back, away from the buildings, into the park, move. It was a police officer, one of the ones I'd seen earlier, and he was waving people away from the row of shops, herding them toward the open green space of Hyde Park, away from the buildings whose windows were still occasionally cracking and falling. Smart. The right thing to do. Get people into the open, away from anything else that might come down. And people were listening mostly, stumbling toward the park, but not everyone. Because near the burning van, maybe 15, 20 yards from it, there was a person on the ground who wasn't moving. I saw them at the same moment a lot of other people must have seen them, and I'll tell you the honest, shameful truth. My first thought was not I must help them. My first thought was thank God it isn't me, and I need to get away from here before whatever's left of that van goes up too. That's the truth. That's what fear does to you. It makes you small and selfish, and it whispers that the most important thing in the entire world is your own skin. I'm not proud of that thought, but I'm telling you about it because I want you to understand the difference between me and the young man across the road. Because where I felt fear and let it turn me inward, he felt the exact same fear. He admitted it himself, and he did the opposite. I saw him break his post. For 300 years more, the soldiers who stand that guard do not leave it. Short of a direct order or the relief of the watch, they stand. It is the entire point of them. It is drilled into them until it's deeper than instinct. And I watched that young man, dusk gray and 23 years old and terrified, take one look at the person lying motionless near the burning van and run toward it. Toward the fire. Toward the thing that everyone else, including a trained police officer, was screaming at people to run away from. He ran toward it. He ran toward the fire. I need you to picture it, because I've tried to describe it to people over the years and the words never quite do it. The street was a ruin, black smoke rolling across it like a living thing, glass crunching underfoot. People stampeding the other way toward the green safety of the park, and a police officer with his arms out wide bellowing at everyone to get back, get back, get back, and through all of that, against all of that, a single figure in a dust-stained red tunic and a great black bearskin hat, running the wrong way, running into it. He dropped the rifle. No, that's not right, he hadn't dropped it. I saw later he'd handed it to the other guard, the one stationed near the door of the building, in one smooth motion as he went past, like even in the middle of all that he wasn't going to just abandon his weapon in the street. Small thing. But it tells you who he was. Even running toward a bomb, the training held. The discipline held. He just pointed it in a different direction. The person on the ground was an older man. I could see that now, as the guard reached him and dropped to his knees beside him. A man in a brown coat, gray-haired, lying half on the pavement and half in the gutter, and he wasn't moving, and there was blood dark on the gray stone, and my stomach turned over because I was certain that the man was dead, and that this young soldier had thrown his life away running to a corpse. But then the old man's arm moved, just a little, a weak, fumbling motion, the way a person moves when they're barely conscious, when they're somewhere far down at the bottom of themselves trying to climb back up. He was alive. And the guard, I watched the whole thing. I couldn't have looked away if the sky had fallen. The guard got his arms under the old man, under his shoulders and his knees, and he lifted him. Just lifted him clean off the ground. The old man wasn't small, and the guard couldn't have been a big lad. All that ceremonial uniform makes them look broader than they are. But he lifted that man like he weighed nothing at all, and he turned, and he started carrying him away from the burning van, toward the park, toward the rest of us. And that's when the second one went off. I don't have words for the second blast the way I do for the first. The first one I remember in detail because I was a whole, calm, ordinary person when it happened, and it broke me into pieces. The second one happened to a person who was already broken, already running on pure animal terror, and so it didn't land the same way. It was just more noise, more pressure, more white. But I know it was smaller than the first. I read that later. The first device had been the big one, the van. The second was smaller, planted near the shop front, set to go off after, the way these cowardly things sometimes are, designed to catch the people who come to help. The rescuers, the brave ones. Designed, in other words, to catch exactly the young man who was at that moment carrying an old stranger across a London street. The blast threw them both. I saw it. I saw the guard's body curl around the old man's as they went down. And I understood, even in my shattered state, that it wasn't an accident, that even as he was being thrown through the air by a bomb, the young soldier was turning his own body into a shield, wrapping himself around the man he was carrying so that he would take the worst of it. They hit the ground hard, smoke everywhere. For a few seconds I couldn't see them at all, just the rolling gray-black of it, and I thought the worst. I thought I'd just watched a young man die doing the most decent thing I'd ever seen a human being do, and I felt something in my chest cave in, this awful hollow grief for a stranger whose name I didn't even know. And then, out of the smoke, he stood up. The bearskin hat was gone. His dark hair was matted with dust, and there was blood on the side of his face, running down from somewhere above his ear, and his red tunic was torn and filthy, and his whole left side looked wrong, the way a person looks when they're hurt worse than they're letting themselves feel. But he stood up, and he reached back down into the smoke, and he got his hands under the old man again, and he kept going. He kept going. I have spent a lot of my life since that day being a coward in small ways, avoiding hard conversations, taking the easy road, telling myself little lies to get out of difficult things. And every single time, somewhere in the back of my head, I see that young man standing up out of the smoke with blood on his face and reaching back down to pick up a stranger and keep walking. And it shames me, and it makes me try to be better. He doesn't know it, he'll never know it, but that one image has probably made me a slightly less rotten person than I would otherwise have been. By now I was moving too. I'd like to tell you that watching him snapped me out of my fear and turned me into a hero. It didn't, not really. I'm an ordinary man. But it did snap me out of the frozen, selfish part of it, the part that just wanted to run. I found myself stumbling toward him and the old man, along with a handful of others. The police officer, a young woman who turned out to be an off-duty nurse, a big bearded fellow in a delivery uniform who I'll never forget either. We met them halfway. The guard was staggering by then, his strength finally going, his face gray under the blood, and the big bearded man and I took the old fellow from his arms and carried him the rest of the way into the park and laid him down on the grass, well away from the buildings, where the nurse dropped to her knees beside him and started doing the things that nurses know how to do. I turned back to the guard. He'd sunk down onto the grass, sitting, his legs out in front of him, his chest heaving, staring at nothing. And I crouched down in front of him and I said something. I don't even remember what, something useless. Are you all right, mate? Can you hear me? And he looked at me. I'll never forget his eyes. He was so young. Up close, without the hat, you could see just how young he was. A boy, really. And his eyes were full of this terrible mix of things, fear and shock and pain and something else. Something that looked almost like confusion, like he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. Like the part of him that had carried that old man through 2 bomb blasts was a stranger he was only now being introduced to. Is he? The guard said. His voice was hoarse. He had to stop and cough, and the cough made him wince and clutch his side. The man, is he? He's alive, I said. The nurse has got him. You did it. You got him out. He's alive because of you. And the young soldier closed his eyes, and his head dropped. And I watched this huge shudder go through his whole body, this release. And I realized he'd been holding himself together by sheer force of will. And now that he knew the man was alive, he could finally let go a little. I wasn't supposed to leave my post, he said, very quietly, almost to himself. We don't leave the post. You left it for the right reason, I told him. He shook his head just slightly. I don't think we're allowed reasons, he said. And then he half laughed, this broken little sound that turned into a cough, and he said, My sergeant's going to kill me. I laughed too. God help me, in the middle of all that, with the smoke and the sirens and the blood, the two of us sat on the grass of Hyde Park and laughed. Because what else can you do? Sometimes a laugh is the only thing that fits in the space where the screaming should be. The sirens were everywhere now. Real, close, overwhelming. Ambulances and fire engines and police cars pouring in from every direction. That whole magnificent machine of a great city responding to its wound. Men and women in high-visibility jackets were swarming the street, and the order that I'd watched dissolve in an instant was, slowly, being stitched back together by people whose entire job is to run toward the things that everyone else runs away from. A paramedic reached us, then another. They went to the old man first. The nurse waved them over, calling out things in that clipped, urgent medical language. And then one of them came to the guard, knelt beside him, started checking him over, asking him questions. What's your name? Where does it hurt? Can you squeeze my hand? His name, I learned listening, was Thomas. I never got his surname, and I've thought about whether I should have tried to find it out, tried to find him over the years, and I've always decided no. Some encounters are meant to be exactly as long as they are. He was Thomas, a guardsman, 23 years old, and he'd just done something that most of us in our whole long lives will never be tested enough to even have the chance to do. While the paramedic worked on him, Thomas kept trying to look past her, over toward where they were working on the old man. He couldn't seem to stop. Every few seconds his eyes would go back there. And at one point he grabbed my sleeve. I was still crouched there beside him. I didn't want to leave him alone, and he said, Stay with him, will you? The old fella, when they take him in the ambulance. So he's not on his own. People shouldn't be on their own when they're frightened. People shouldn't be on their own when they're frightened. I have turned that sentence over in my mind 10,000 times. This bleeding, battered young man, who had every right in the world to be thinking only of himself, of his own pain, of his own survival. And the thing he was worried about was that a frightened stranger might have to be alone for a few minutes in the back of an ambulance. "I'll stay with him," I promised, and I meant it. They got the old man onto a stretcher. He was conscious by then, drifting in and out but conscious, his eyes flickering open, his lips moving. As they lifted him, his head turned, and his gaze found the guard sitting on the grass a few feet away, and the two of them looked at each other, the old man and the young soldier who'd carried him out of the fire, and neither of them said anything because some things are too big for words, but the old man lifted his hand just a few inches off the stretcher, palm open, and Thomas lifted his hand back. And that was all. That was the whole conversation. And it was the most eloquent thing I've ever seen. I went with the old man as I'd promised, climbed into the back of the ambulance and held his hand while they worked, and told him over and over that he was going to be all right, that he was safe now, that the young soldier had got him out. He squeezed my fingers. At one point, clear as anything through the oxygen mask, he said, "The boy in the red coat." And I said yes, the boy in the red coat. And the old man closed his eyes and a tear ran down into his gray hair and he said, "Tell him thank you, tell him I won't forget." I never got the chance to tell Thomas that in the end. By the time I came back out of the hospital hours later, the scene had changed completely, sealed off, swarming with police and investigators, and Thomas was long gone, taken to a different hospital, I assumed, to have his own injuries seen to. I stood at the edge of a police cordon on a street I no longer recognized, with the old man's words in my mouth and nobody to give them to. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Because there's more to tell about that morning in the park. There's the part I haven't told you yet, the part about why Thomas standing his post in the first place mattered so much more than I understood at the time. The part about what was happening behind him at that grand white building while the bombs were going off. Because it turned out the building Thomas was guarding wasn't just any building. And there were people inside it. I didn't learn all of this on the day. I pieced it together afterward, from the news, from the inquiry, from the long articles that came out in the weeks and months that followed, when the whole country was trying to understand what had happened and how, and who the people were that had risen to meet it. The building behind Thomas housed, that morning, a gathering, a meeting of some significance. I'll be careful here, because even now there are things about that day that were never made fully public, but I can tell you that there were people of importance inside, and there were a great many ordinary people too, staff and visitors, dozens of them. And when the first bomb went off, every one of them was in danger of doing the single most dangerous thing a crowd can do. They were in danger of panicking, of stampeding, of pouring out of every door into a street that, unknown to them, still had a second bomb waiting to go off. And the thing that stopped them, one of the things anyway, was a young man in a red coat standing perfectly still outside the main entrance. I've read accounts from people who were inside. They said that in the chaos after the blast, with alarms going and smoke visible through the windows and everyone's first instinct screaming, "Get out, get out, get into the open," they looked through the doors and they saw the guard, standing, calm, unmoving. And several of them said the same thing in slightly different words. If it was safe enough for him to stand there, it couldn't be as bad as it seemed. Surely it couldn't. Look, the soldiers not even moving. It bought time, just a little, just enough. Enough for the security staff inside to take control, to stop the doors from bursting open, to start moving people calmly toward the back of the building, away from the street, away from the second bomb. Enough, the inquiry later suggested, to save lives that would otherwise have been lost in the crush and the blast. Thomas didn't know any of that, of course. When he was standing there, refusing to move in the seconds after the first explosion, he wasn't thinking, "I am buying time for the people behind me." He was just thinking, "You do not leave your post." He was just doing the thing he'd been trained to do, the thing soldiers before him had done for centuries, the simple, stubborn, magnificent thing of standing still when every fiber of your being wants to run. But that simple act, standing still, saved people. And then, when standing still was no longer the right thing, when there was a man dying in the street who needed a pair of strong young arms, he did the opposite. He moved. He broke 300 years of unbroken tradition without a second's hesitation, because a person needed him more than the tradition did. That's the thing about Thomas that I've never been able to get over. Not that he was brave, though God knows he was. It's that he knew, somehow, in the space of a few seconds, with bombs going off around him, which kind of brave each moment needed. The brave of standing still, and then the brave of running in. Most of us go our whole lives without learning to tell those two apart. He worked it out in the worst 90 seconds imaginable, and he got it right both times. The investigators came in the days that followed. The inquiry. The questions about how it had happened, why the van hadn't been spotted sooner, whether the warnings had been missed. I won't pretend to understand all of it, and I won't pretend the failures didn't matter, because they did, and people were rightly angry about them. A bomb went off in the middle of London. People were hurt. Some of the wounds from that day never fully healed, and I don't just mean the physical ones. But in among all the anger and the questions and the grief, there was Thomas. There was the story of the boy in the red coat, and it spread through the city and then through the country, and people held on to it the way you hold onto a small, warm thing on a cold night. Because in the middle of something designed to make us all feel afraid and helpless and alone, here was proof, living, breathing, bleeding proof, that we are not, in fact, only as good as our worst moment. That when the worst comes, some of us, the best of us, run toward it. There's a thing I haven't told you yet, the hardest part. What happened to Thomas after that day, and what I found out years later by complete accident in a place I never expected. But that's for the last part of the story. For a long time after that day, I didn't talk about it. That surprises people when I tell them. They assume that if you witness something like that, something that big, something that important, you'd want to tell everyone. You dine out on it for the rest of your life. Did I ever tell you about the time I was there when the bomb went off near Hyde Park? But it wasn't like that. For years I couldn't. The few times I tried in the early days, I'd get a sentence or two in, and then my throat would close and my eyes would sting and I'd have to stop. My wife understood. She'd put her hand on my arm and change the subject, and I'd be grateful. The truth is, I think I felt I didn't have the right to tell it. Who was I in that story? Just a tourist with a notebook who froze, and then helped carry an old man a few yards across some grass. The real story belonged to Thomas, and Thomas was gone, vanished back into the great anonymous machine of the army, and it felt wrong, somehow, to make myself a character in his story. So I kept it. I folded it up small and I kept it somewhere deep inside me, and I took it out only on the bad nights, the 3 in the morning nights, when I'd lie there and watch him stand up out of the smoke again and reach back down for the old man again, over and over. The old man, by the way, lived. I should tell you that because I know you've been wondering. I stayed with him in that ambulance and I held his hand, and he made it. He had a broken hip and some nasty burns and a long, hard recovery ahead of him, but he lived. His daughter found me at the hospital that night, a kind, frantic woman in her 40s, and she hugged me, this complete stranger, and cried into my shoulder, and I told her it wasn't me she should be thanking, it was the boy in the red coat. And she said, "I know. We've all heard about the boy in the red coat," and she cried harder. I lost touch with them the way you do. Life moves on. The trip ended, I flew home a few days later, shaken, changed, the rest of my holiday a write-off, and I went back to my small town and my ordinary life, and the years did what years do. They piled up. They softened the edges of it. The 3 in the morning nights got rarer. I almost let myself believe I'd put it behind me. And then, 11 years later, I walked into a small cafe in a town 2 hours from my own, on a wet Saturday afternoon, completely by chance, to get out of the rain. And he was there. I knew him at once. Isn't that strange, 11 years? He was a man in his mid-30s now, no longer a boy, heavier through the shoulders, a few lines around his eyes, a closely trimmed beard going just slightly gray at the edges. By every reasonable measure, he looked nothing like the smooth-faced 23-year-old I'd watched stand up out of the smoke. But I knew him. The moment I saw him, something in my chest went tight and cold and certain, the way it does when the past walks up and taps you on the shoulder. It was the eyes. It was the same eyes. He was sitting in the corner with a cup of tea and a folded newspaper, and there was a little girl with him, maybe 7 or 8, drawing in a coloring book and chattering away while he listened with that patient, half-smiling attention that good fathers have. He had a wedding ring. He looked, and I want to choose this word carefully, he looked settled, like a man who had made it through to the other side of something and built a quiet, good life out of the wreckage. I stood there in the doorway with the rain dripping off me, and I did not know what to do. Part of me, most of me, wanted to leave, to turn around and walk back out into the rain and let him have his peaceful Saturday with his daughter. Who was I to walk up to a stranger and drag 11 years of horror back into the room? What right did I have? He'd clearly built a life. He'd clearly found peace. And here I was, the ghost of the worst day of his life, about to come and sit down at his table. I almost did it. I almost left. My hand was actually on the door. And then I thought of the old man in the ambulance. Tell him thank you. Tell him I won't forget. A message I'd carried for 11 years and never been able to deliver. And I thought, maybe this is why. Maybe everything, the rain, the strange town, the random cafe, maybe all of it was so that an old man's thank you could finally reach the boy in the red coat. So I took my hand off the door, and I walked over. "Excuse me," I said. My voice came out wrong, too thick. "I'm sorry to bother you, you don't know me, but were you a guardsman, years ago, in London?" He looked up at me, and I watched something move behind his eyes, a wariness, a bracing. He'd been recognized before, I realized. Of course he had. For a while after, his face had been in the papers, the boy in the red coat, and people must have come up to him over the years, wanting a piece of it, wanting to touch the story. And I felt a hot rush of shame, certain now that I'd made a terrible mistake. "I was," he said, carefully, polite but guarded, "long time ago now." "I was there," I said, "near Hyde Park the day of the I was there. I saw what you did. I was the one who went with the old man in the ambulance. The man you carried out. You asked me to stay with him so he wouldn't be alone, and I stayed with him. He lived. I don't know if you ever knew that. He lived." I watched the words land. I watched 11 years come apart in his face. The wariness went first. Then something underneath it, something raw and young, the 23-year-old surfacing through the 34-year-old, and his eyes filled, just like that, instantly, the way eyes do when they've been holding something for a very long time. His daughter had stopped coloring and was looking up at us. Her crayon paused, sensing in the way children do that something important was happening that she didn't understand. "He lived," Thomas repeated, barely a whisper. "He lived," I said again. "He had a daughter, a granddaughter, I think, maybe 2. He told me to tell you something. I've been carrying it 11 years and I never knew how I'd ever give it to you. He said, tell him thank you, and tell him I won't forget." And the boy in the red coat, the man, the father, the husband, sitting in a quiet cafe on a rainy afternoon, put his hand over his mouth, and his shoulders shook and he wept. He asked me to sit down. I did. His daughter, bless her, after a worried look at her father, decided that the adults were being boring and went back to her coloring, and that gave the two of us a kind of privacy, the strange private bubble you get in a public place when something true is happening. We talked for a long time. The tea went cold. The rain kept on against the windows. He told me what happened to him after. The injuries had been worse than they looked that day: a punctured lung, a shattered something or other in his side, weeks in hospital, months of recovery. And then the other kind of injury, the kind that doesn't show up on an X-ray. The nightmares. The way a car backfiring would put him on the ground in a public street, shaking. The years where he couldn't be in a crowd, couldn't hear a siren, couldn't smell smoke without the whole thing rushing back. He'd left the army. He'd had to. The thing that had made him a hero had also broken something in him that took the better part of a decade to mend. For a long time, he said, turning his cold tea around and around in its saucer, I couldn't decide if I'd done the right thing. Leaving the post. We're not meant to leave the post. And I left it. And then everything that happened to me after, the lung, the nightmares, all of it, there was a part of me that kept saying, that's what you get. That's what you get for leaving your post. Like I was being punished for it. He looked up at me. And I didn't even know if he'd lived. The old man. They never told me. I went looking after, but the privacy rules, and I didn't have a name, and I never knew. For 11 years I didn't know if I'd thrown my whole life off course to carry a man who died anyway. I'll tell you, my eyes weren't dry by this point either. He lived, I said for the third time. He lived 11 years at least, and maybe he's living still. You didn't throw your life off course for nothing. You traded some of your own peace so that an old man could go home to his daughter. That's not a punishment. That's the most honorable trade a person can make. He was quiet for a long moment. My sergeant, he said finally with the ghost of a smile, never did kill me. I always told that as a joke after my sergeant's going to kill me. He didn't. He came to see me in the hospital. Big hard man, frightened the life out of all of us in training. And he sat by my bed and he didn't say anything for a while, and then he said, Thomas's voice caught. He said, son, the post is a thing we guard so that we never forget how to guard a person. You didn't break the tradition. You're the reason it exists. We sat with that for a while, the two of us. The little girl colored. The rain came down. I've thought a great deal, in the years since that cafe, about what I actually witnessed that day near Hyde Park. It would be easy to make it a simple story. A brave soldier, a bomb, a rescue. And it is that story, and that story is true, and it's worth telling on its own. But the longer I've lived with it, the more I've come to feel that the real thing I saw was something quieter and stranger and harder to name. I think I saw what a person is for. We spend so much of our lives, most of us, never finding out. We go to work and come home and worry about money and grow old, and the question of what we'd do, who we'd be, if everything went to pieces around us, that question just never gets asked. We can go a whole lifetime without an answer. And maybe that's a mercy. Maybe it's a kind of grace to never be tested that hard. But Thomas was tested. In the space of 90 seconds, in the worst circumstances imaginable, life reached out and asked him the question, who are you really underneath everything? And he answered it, not with words, with his body. With his refusal to run when running would have been understandable, and then with his refusal to stand still when a man needed carrying. He answered the question completely, in full, with nothing held back. And the answer was, I am someone who stands his post. And I am someone who breaks it to save a life. And I am, somehow, both of those at once. Most of us will never have to answer that question so fully. But I think I've come to believe that the answer is in us anyway. That it was in me, that frozen morning, even though I nearly ran, even though I was small and afraid. The capacity is in all of us. We just hope, most of us, that we never have to find out for sure. Thomas found out. And on the day he found out, with a great city coming apart around him and his own body screaming at him to save itself, he chose, twice over in two opposite ways, to be the kind of person the rest of us only hope we'd be. I said goodbye to him in that cafe, eventually. The rain had eased off to a drizzle. His daughter had finished her picture, a house, a son, 3 stick figures holding hands, and she held it up proudly for me to admire. And I told her with complete honesty that it was the finest picture I'd seen in years. At the door, Thomas shook my hand, held it a moment longer than a handshake usually lasts. Thank you, he said, for staying with him and for finding me. You didn't have to, you could have walked out when you saw me. I'd have understood. I nearly did, I admitted. But you didn't. He smiled, a real one, the smile I'd seen the corner of all those years ago when the little girl waved at him, finally allowed all the way out. People shouldn't have to carry a thing like that alone for 11 years, he said. On either end of it. And then he went back to his daughter and his cold tea, and I went out into the soft gray rain, and I have never seen him again. I'm an old man now, older than the gray-haired fellow in the brown coat was, that day in the gutter. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be, and my memory plays its tricks, and there are mornings I can't recall what I had for dinner the night before. But I remember that day with a clarity that frightens me. I remember the smell of the cheap coffee, and the pigeons hoping for crumbs, and the little girl waving with both hands, and the way the corner of his mouth nearly turned up. I remember the slap of the first blast and the white nothing of it. And I remember, most of all, a young man in a dusk-gray-red coat standing perfectly still in the middle of a burning street, and then running the wrong way, into the smoke, to pick up a stranger. People ask me sometimes, the few I've ever told, whether the world is a good place or a bad one. They ask it like it's a hard question, and I understand why. There's a great deal of evidence on the dark side of the ledger. There was a bomb in a van, after all, parked on a curb by someone who wanted to turn a gray London morning into a slaughter, and that's real, and I won't pretend it isn't. But I was there. I saw both things on the same morning in the same street within the same 90 seconds. I saw the very worst that people can choose to be. And then, not 20 yards away, in a red coat, I saw the very best. And I'll tell you what I learned, standing in that street with blood in my eyebrow and ringing in my ears, watching a terrified boy do the bravest thing I've ever seen a human being do. The bomb was loud, but the boy who stood his post was louder, and in the end it's his sound that the years have kept, not the blast, but the silence of a young man refusing to move, and then the quiet, certain footsteps of him running in. That's the sound I'll hear at the very end, I think, when my own post comes to be relieved. The boy in the red coat, still standing, still running in. Tell him thank you, tell him I won't forget. I never have.